Hey guys, Jake Steele, Iron and Steel. This is podcast episode number 8. And man, thanks so much for being here. So today's story is kind of a special one to me. I wrote it quite a while ago, 4 or 5 years ago at least. And it's about my friend Jack Corley. And anybody that's been around in the Pacific Northwest and involved with hot rods or custom cars or race cars or whatever, if you've been around for any amount of time, you know the name Jack Corley. And for anybody that doesn't, I'll get into it, of course, in the story, but Jack was just a lifelong hot rodder, race car driver, and worked his way into owning a business where he sold obsolete parts. So, if you're a hot rod guy like me and my friends, you need something for your flathead Ford, you just called Jack. And he would have it in stock, and you ran down there and visit with him for a little while and, pay him, and you're on your way. But so it was nice having Jack around, number one, because he was a fantastic guy and a wealth of knowledge, knew a little bit about everything. And two, it was just super convenient to be able to go down there and get the part that you need right then and be back on the road the same day or whatever. So just an all-around great guy, Jack Corley. Anybody that doesn't know, Jack sadly passed away just a few months ago. I think the end of January. But yeah, so he was definitely up there in years, but it was not an easy thing for the hot rod community up here. Again, Jack had a lot of friends. He was pretty much a friend to everybody, and everybody really liked Jack. And so I definitely fall into that category. Jack was a good friend of mine, and I feel fortunate to be able to tell you his story. And I was happy to be able to document it before he passed. So anyway, that's what today's story is going to be about. IronandSteel.com is the website. This article is called You Don't Know Jack. And again, it's older, so I think it's probably on the second or third page, but definitely would recommend going there, checking out the article, just so you can see the photos. There's some great pictures that my friend Ben took of Jack and of his facility and his warehouse, and it just gives you a kind of a better scope of who Jack was as a person, and kind of ties it all together. So again, You Don't Know Jack, IronandSteel.com. Check that out at your leisure. But yeah, for now, kick back and relax, and I'll tell you all about my friend Jack. Thanks again for being here. The building itself, unremarkable. Something you could drive past 100 times and never think twice about. Its surroundings are equally unremarkable. A small rental house on one side, and another uninspired-looking warehouse facility on the other. What happens there, nobody knows. There's nothing to distinguish this particular building other than the address, which is 909, and hastily stenciled above the faded red door. There's nothing flashy about it, but this windowless, nondescript brown building on the soggy outskirts of Portland, Oregon, is a portal to another time. This is the home of Jack's Specialty Parts. And despite outward appearances, what's on the inside of these four walls is nothing short of magical. But of all the treasures inside, the one that shines the brightest is the proprietor himself, Jack Corley. Walking into Jack's place is hard to describe. It's sort of a unique mixture of business and museum. Just about every inch of wall space is covered in something interesting to look at. Everything from gas and oil signs to old parts store displays or car club plaques, or flyers advertising races that were held 70 years ago. The center of the facility houses row after row of tall industrial shelving units, each one neatly organized into specific sections. A closer look reveals a system that is simple and functional, if you know how to navigate it. Now take the time to ask Jack himself how he tracks his inventory and you'll get a sideways smirk as he points to his flat top. "It's all up here. Every bit of it," Jack says. Now, if you find it hard to believe that inventory consisting of thousands upon thousands of antiquated parts can be organized and tracked entirely in the head of a nearly 90-year-old man, well, then it's just like the title says. You don't know Jack. Now, if we're talking about hot rodding in the Portland, Oregon area, we're not going to make it very far into the conversation without mentioning Jack Corley. There are few still with us that perfectly embody the way it was, quite the way he does it. Jack was in his 20s in the 1950s when hot rodding absolutely exploded. Now, it may have started in California, but it surely did not miss the Pacific Northwest, and Jack was right smack dab in the middle of it all. In high school, Jack enlisted in the Marine Corps Reserves. He had no way to know it at the time, but the Korean War was about to break out. And before he knew it, he was shipped off. Now, luckily, war would end before his service was needed, and he never made it farther than his base in California. "Hollywood Marine," Jack says with a smirk and a wink. "Well, that's what you'd call it, and that was me. I didn't see combat, but I saw a lot of neat cars down there." Jack's love affair with cars began at an early age. Like most young guys, he was interested in hot rods, and he spent his fair share of time cruising, street racing, and hopping drive-ins around the Portland area. His first taste of real racing began in the early 1950s. Stock cars at first, then drag racing with the Ramblers Car Club, of which he was a founding member. In 1955, he bought his first midget and was instantly hooked. Jack became heavily involved with midget racing in the Northwest and beyond. He says, "Up here, the racing season ended around Labor Day, if not before, because of the rain. But in California, their season went a lot longer, through October. So when the racing ended up here, I'd hitch up my car and drag it down to the Bay Area and run a few more weekends." If you visit Jack's shop, you'll quickly see how large of a role that era played in his life. Besides the midgets in the main area, the last remaining of the 16 he has owned and raced over the years, by the way, there is a room completely dedicated strictly to Offie motors and the parts to rebuild them. If you're lucky enough to be allowed into his office area, you'll see just how close to the heart Jack holds that time in his life. Now, once you process the fact that the walls are covered from floor to ceiling in framed 8x10 photos of Jack's racing highlights spanning multiple decades, the next thing you'll need to wrap your head around is the fact that you can point to any one of them, and Jack will tell you exactly when the photo was taken, who the driver in the photo is, and exactly why it's significant. And if you want to double check his accuracy, feel free. Every one of them is meticulously labeled in very fine print on the back sides. Now, of course, all of this racing had to be funded somehow. Back then, there were few corporate sponsor deals going around, and most of these guys were just working stiffs out to have a little fun. Jack was no exception. Of course, he didn't venture far from the world of four wheels, and he began his career at a Kaiser dealership, working in the parts and service department. From there, Jack would move strictly to the parts side of the business, eventually spending nearly 20 years with the Niehoff Company. "I was the first guy to oversee $1 million territory," Jack says. "I traveled a lot in those days, and they would buy companies out, and I'd go there and get the warehouses changed over and get them whipped into shape. It wasn't uncommon for me to be in Mississippi one week and LA the next. Almost all of it I would drive rather than fly, which I preferred. It paid the bills and it was fun." Along the way, Jack learned that there was an added perk to being in this line of work. And I did not mean for that to rhyme, but apparently we're going full Dr. Seuss mode here. Anyway, as Jack puts it, well, a lot of times I'd go into a warehouse to do a changeover or maybe a big inventory audit, whatever the case was. Well, more often than not, there'd be this big old pile of obsolete parts left over. These were parts for older cars that they just hadn't sold, and they wanted them off the books. Now, of course, the factory wasn't going to take them back, so the big bosses would just want them to go away. I'd give them maybe $25 or $50, whatever the case was. Sometimes they'd give me the parts just so they wouldn't have to deal with throwing them in the dumpster. I'd drag them home and pedal them off at races and swap meets, and before long, I ended up with a lot of these parts. It just kept growing over the years. What you see here isn't even close to half of what I had before I moved into this smaller building. In addition, Jack became a distributor for M&H Tires, along with half a dozen other companies that specialized in race car and speed equipment. This would turn into what he promoted as Jack's Specialty Speed Parts, which operated mostly from racetracks and out of his home. As time went on and the racing went away, he would drop the speed part from the name in order to appeal to a broader market. He now caters to mostly restorers and hot rodders looking for that one obscure part in NOS. Now, I find myself at Jack's a few times a month, sometimes to buy parts, sometimes just to BS. I can tell you with honesty that over the years, anything I've ever asked for, he has either walked over to the shelf and grabbed it, or said no right away. I've never known there to be such a thing as, I'll have to look and see if I have that or not. This man knows what he has and where it is. Pretty impressive, considering most of us can't remember what we had for breakfast. Now, in addition to being a great source of antique car parts and a wealth of information, Jack Corley is also just a plain old nice guy with a ton of hot rod and race car stories. He's the kind of guy that you could sit around and listen to him talk for hours, if you could just get him to slow down and take a break for that long. I have never walked into Jack's shop and found him just lounging around. Jack is always doing something. Shuffling parts from here to there, climbing up a stepladder to retrieve some dusty old box that contains that one thing some guy needed, answering the phone, or loading his truck for a swap meet. Oh, and if you can't find him at his shop, chances are he's out cruising his Hemi-powered 32 Ford Roadster that he has owned for many, many decades. But that will have to be another story for another day. Okay, there you have it. You don't know Jack. Well, now I guess you kind of do, at least a little bit. Even that short story was pretty difficult to get out of Jack because, like I mentioned at the end of that story, he didn't want to slow down for anything. The guy was just always moving. And so it was tough to get him to slow down and even tell me that much about his life. And the other thing was he wasn't a guy that liked to talk about himself. That wasn't part of his nature. He'd sit there and talk about cars with you. But, Jack didn't want to talk about Jack. He didn't think he was anybody special or anything like that. He was, just a regular guy, and his deal was cars. He liked old cars and hot rods and racing, and that was that. So, yeah, Jack Corley. You don't know Jack was the name of that. Again, ironandsteel.com is the website. Go there and find that article. I think it's on the second page. Check out the photos of Jack and his stuff, and just kind of get a feel for who he was. The photos are great, actually. My buddy Ben took them, and he's a fantastic photographer, so the pictures are great. It really gives you a sense of who Jack Corley was. And anyway, he was a fantastic guy and will be sorely missed. That's for sure. So, thanks for listening to that. I forgot to mention at the beginning that I was going to do a couple of these Q&As today also, so I'm going to jump into that real quick. I had a few people message me and ask a few questions, and so I'll just jump into that real quick. So one of them says, are you going to Bonneville this year? I feel stupid for not reaching out last year. So I think so. I'm not quite sure yet. There's a show in Pendleton coming up here at the time that I'm recording this. It's next weekend, and then Bonneville's the weekend after that. So I guess it depends on how I feel after the Pendleton trip and all that stuff. It's supposed to be like 110 or some crazy shit. So yeah, we'll see. So I'm hoping to make it to Bonneville. If I do, I'm going to drag a car with me. I don't know exactly which one it'll be, but plan for now is to, yes, be at Bonneville, drag a car, and have some fun. So, and roast to death on the salt. So this was an interesting question. This says, if you could take one of your 36s back in time and take it to a shop of your choice, what shop would it be? It's kind of interesting. I don't know. I've never thought about that. And what's interesting is most of the cars that were being, produced back then, custom cars, they were being built by just regular guys. There were, of course, shops doing this custom work, but 8 out of 10 cars that, we're looking at pictures of from back in the day, these were guys that just built them in their garage in their spare time. It was like their only car, and, they would like French one headlight or whatever over the weekend and then drive it that way to work all week, and then French the other one the next, or whatever. So most of the cars were just built by regular guys back in the day. I guess if I were picking and choosing, if I could go, quote, back in time, I would probably take my Roadster and maybe go see Harry Westergaard. I mean, he's one of the earliest of the bunch, and hugely influential to basically everybody that came after him. So I guess if you're gonna play the game of go back in time, what would you do? Yeah, I would probably go see our buddy Harry. So, but luckily we don't have to go back in time. There are some great shops that exist now that are building incredible cars, and I talk about East Bay Speed and Custom quite a bit because they're friends of mine, and I really do love the work that they produce and the people that they are. But it's just one great example of some of the shops that are still around today, or that are around today, that are producing cars in the same style. So yeah, long version is that. I guess the short version is Harry Westergaard and / you don't have to go back in time. You can just go see Brandon Flaner over at East Bay Speed and Custom. So another question was, why Fords? Why not other makes like Mopar or GM? I guess a lot of that has to do with kind of the fact that, we're all sort of in love with and emulating the things that these guys did, quote, back in the day. And a majority of the cars that were being customized back in the day were early Fords. Not all of them. There are a ton of examples of, early custom Chevrolets and shit like that. But most of the guys that were building custom cars back in the day were customizing Fords. And the reason for that is pretty simple. They were the most beautiful cars being produced, and the best looking cars kind of right out of the chute. So they made the easiest subjects to customize and make what you wanted. So they were already a beautiful car, and the guys back in the early days were just kind of taking those already beautiful cars and improving on that and making them unique and even prettier. So yeah, short version, because they were the best looking. And I don't think anybody can argue that a 36 Ford, or of the cars produced in 1936 or 1940, just as examples, I don't think anybody could really make the argument that there's a better looking car than Ford for those years. So yeah, that was pretty much all the questions I got this week. So think I'll just wrap it up there. Again, thanks so much for listening to that story about my buddy Jack. He really was a special guy, just a super nice guy that everybody really loved, and man, he will be missed. So again, ironandsteel.com. You don't know Jack, go check out that article. While you're there, please hit the subscribe button, punch in your email, and then that way you'll get updates when there's new articles or new podcasts or whatever the case may be. So it takes 2 seconds. ironandsteel.com, hit the subscribe button. Another thing too, just real quick, man, I'm getting a ton of messages from people saying like, hey, really enjoy the podcast, really appreciate it. A lot of messages that are like, I don't listen to podcasts, but I really enjoy yours. And I just want to say thank you for that. And then as a side note, don't tell me, tell everybody else, please. So if you enjoy this podcast or any of the articles or any of the content on ironandsteel.com, I appreciate the comments, but just do me a favor and save them for conversations you're having with other people. And if you enjoy it, let everybody know or anybody know. I would really appreciate it. So, okay. Again, thanks so much for being here. And I guess we'll do this again in 1 week. We'll see you later.